Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stephen Kingcast, one man's musings on the works of Stephen King. Each week, we'll review one entry in the bibliography of Stephen King in the chronological order of publication. And this week, we are going to be reviewing Stephen King's second novel, 1975's small-town tale of vampirism, Salem's Lot. If you had tuned into the first week's podcast in which I covered Carrie, I discussed how I discovered King with It, and the subsequent binge read of every one of his then published novels. Like most of Stephen King's properties, even if I hadn't read the story by King, I was aware of it. I knew that Salem's Lot was a vampire story in a small town with the name of the book, and I had seen parts of the TV movie from the 1970s and of course was familiar of it through the Simpsons annual Treehouse of Terror 1993 episode. I believe I first read Salem's Lot in the fall. I don't know if I read it in the fall the first time, but I distinctly remember rereading it a few years later around Halloween. When compiling a list of Halloween books, I never really see Salem's Lot included in any list, but I strongly recommend this to be read around October 31st, with the beautiful imagery of a small town under the moonlight, while menacing shadows stalk their prey through the dark woods. It is an essential read if you appreciate spooky stories to tell in the dark. This is now the third time I'm reading Salem's Lot, and I'm happy to say that I enjoyed it just as much the third time around as I did the first two. So, before we get into our review, I'm going to take a few moments to read the Wikipedia summary. Salem's Lot is the second book published by Stephen King. The book was published by Doubleday on October 17, 1975. The novel is preceded by the prequel Jerusalem's Lot and followed by the sequel One for the Road, both included in King's 1978 short story collection Night Shift and in the 2005 illustrated edition of the novel. Summary. Ben Mears, a successful writer who grew up in the town of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine, has returned home after 25 years. Once in town, he meets local high school teacher Matt Burke and strikes up a romantic relationship with Susan Norton, a young college graduate. Ben starts writing a book about the Marston House, an abandoned mansion where he had a terrifying experience as a child. Mears learns that the Marston House, the former home of Depression-area hitman Hubert Hubie Marston, has been purchased by Kurt Barlow, an Austrian immigrant who has arrived in the lot to ostensibly open an antique store. Barlow is a recluse. Only his familiar Richard Straker is seen in public. The duo's arrival coincides with the disappearance of a young boy, Ralphie Glick, and the death of his brother Danny, who becomes the town's first vampire, infecting such locals as Mike Ryerson, Randy McDougal, Jack Griffin, and Danny's own mother, Marjorie Glick. Danny fails to infect Mark Petrie, who resists him successfully. Over the course of several weeks, almost all of the townspeople are infected. Ben Mears and Susan are joined by Matt Burke and his doctor, Jimmy Cody, along with a young Mark Petrie and the local priest, Father Callahan, in an effort to fight the spread of the vampires, whose numbers increase as the new vampires infect their own families and others. Susan is captured by Barlow before Mark has a chance to rescue her. Susan becomes a vampire, but is eventually staked through the heart by Mears, the man who loved her. Father Callahan is caught by Barlow at the Petrie house after Barlow kills Mark's parents, but does not infect them, so they're later given a clean burial. Barlow holds Mark hostage, but Father Callahan has the upper hand, securing Mark's release, agreeing to Barlow's demand that he toss aside his cross and face him on equal terms. However, he delays throwing the cross aside, and the once powerful religious symbol loses its strength until Barlow can not only approach Callahan, but breaks the cross, now nothing more than two small pieces of plaster, into bits. Barlow says, "Sad to see a man's faith fail him," then forces the helpless Callahan to drink blood from Barlow's neck. Callahan resists, but cannot hold out forever and is forced to drink, leaving him trapped in another world, as Barlow has left his mark. When Callahan tries to re-enter his church, he receives an electric shock, preventing him from going inside. Callahan disappears forever from the lot. Jimmy Cody is killed when he falls from a rigged staircase and is impaled by knives by the one-time denizens of Eva Miller's boarding house, Mears' one-time residents, who have now all become vampires. Matt Burke dies from a heart attack in a town hospital. Ben Mears and Mark Petrie succeed in destroying the master vampire Barlow, but are lucky to escape with their lives and are forced to leave the town to the now leaderless vampires. The novel's prologue, which is set shortly after the end of the story proper, describes the men's flight across the country to a seaside town in Mexico, where they stop to recover from their ordeal. Mark Petrie is received into the Catholic Church by a friendly local priest. The epilogue has the two returning to the town a year later, intending to renew the battle. Ben, knowing that there are too many hiding places for the town vampires, sets the town on fire with the intent of destroying it and the Marston house once and for all. So for the rest of the podcast, we're going to be talking about the characters and the effectiveness of his writing. So just for all intents and purposes, so everyone knows, the edition that I'm reading, it's the first edition from 1975 from Doubleday and Company. It's an old beat up edition that my father gave to me that he found in the library of the old fire station that I used to work in. So when I refer to page numbers, it's from this particular edition that I'm reading. But to start us off, what I would like to do while Carrie is still so fresh in my mind, I want to talk about some leftovers that I've found from Carrie into Salem's Lot, because I think that when reading his novels chronologically, you can start to spot the themes and ideas that he passes off to himself from one book to the next, like a relay baton. So just like in Carrie, in Salem's Lot, he inserts news articles and journal entries into the narrative, as seen on page 5, and later in the book with Ben's journal. He also includes a doctor's report on page 106. So while not as prevalent as it was in Carrie, it's definitely something that he still likes to play with, or else he wouldn't have done it. And furthermore, just like we have in Carrie, we have another telepathically linked death. So in his first book, we saw that Sue Snell and Carrie White were linked telepathically at the end, just as Carrie died. And due to the telepathic connection, Sue experienced Carrie's death. Something similar happens here on pages 113 and 114, when Manella Corey describes the moment of her sister's death at the hands of Hubert Marston. It's similar in concept, but in Salem's Lot, King reworks this idea for a more horrifying and unsettling effect. So basically, he's really trying to increase the feeling of dread and terror, and he's building this great tone. So it's not so much a moment where two characters are understanding each other as it's presented in Carrie. It's presented as a ghost story here, and it's incredibly effective. And then the last thing that I found, I'm sorry, not the last, but one more thing that I found between Carrie and Salem's Lot was another mother-daughter relationship. So on page 29 to 32, we're introduced to Susan's mother, and there's conflict, much like the previous novel, but it's a much, much more natural, relatable, and healthy conflict. At first, Mrs. Norton is very patient and loving and very doting, a little pushy, but it all comes from a place of love, not hate, not like Margaret. So Mrs. Norton's going to go a bit further in the novel. She's going to step out of this doting place, and it's going to become offensive, her actions, but definitely compared to Margaret White, she deserves a Mother of the Year award. And last but not least, one carryover that I found is that of the bully. So on page 52, we are introduced to Richie Bodden, the schoolyard bully who targets the new kid, Mark Petrie. In a surprising and incredibly satisfying turn of events, the potential victim utterly defeats and humiliates our bully, almost as if King is imposing karmic retribution on the bully archetype established in his breakout novel. So those are just some aspects of Carrie that I found had infiltrated Salem's Lot. So let's take a few moments to talk about the tone of this novel. So although Carrie might have been his first novel, this is the first novel in the genre that he's going to be synonymous with for the entirety of his career. Because unlike Carrie, which was a science fiction story, Salem's Lot is a gothic ghost story filled with Halloween-rich imagery and scenes that cause genuine fright. This is a perfect story to be read late at night. I believe that the reason Carrie was so successful was due to its premise. It's a premise that just sells itself. I mean, think about it. Superpowered girl gets revenge on her bullies. That's what we call an elevator pitch. And it's this is not to say that there wasn't any talent in his writing in Carrie. There certainly is. I mean, King is definitely on display, but I think that that novel, the popularity of that novel, spread due to the power of the concept of the novel. Now, Salem's Lot, King doesn't have quite a concept, which isn't to take anything away from Salem's Lot, but at the time, as I had said in the Carrie review, at the time superpowers were not in, so it was a very novel. Whereas in Salem's Lot, vampires have been done before. Vampires certainly were not what they are today. But I mean, this is coming, around the era. I mean, of the Hammer films, and certainly we have the image of Bela Lugosi. Bram Stoker is a household name. So I mean that the image and all the connotations of vampires were there. But what Stephen King does with Salem's Lot, he takes it and he places the Dracula story in the small towns of which he was so familiar, and masterfully creates a sense of growing dread that becomes a character in its own right. So, nothing against Carrie, but this is, I would say, the beginning of Stephen King. This is Stephen King, the master of horror's first novel. And I think that if Salem's Lot had come out first instead of Carrie, it would have been just as successful for him. He did not get lucky with Carrie. I think that if Salem's Lot had come out first, people wouldn't be talking about the premise so much as they would be talking about how powerful the writing in this novel is. Because, as I'm going to get into in a little bit, Salem's Lot, the town, really comes to life, and you feel as though you are living there. So when the character starts to turn, and the characters start to get an impression that something is off because of the growing dread that's so palpable on the page, you feel it because you feel as though you're living in this town and you have a history of the town. And really, King's strengths as a writer are very, very much on display in this novel. And all of this would not have worked had he not been able to build up the threat of the Marston house, how it just perches over the town like a monster, a dark idol, it's called. He gives it a history. It's a shadow from which they cannot escape. From the first emergence of Barlow to a fatal walk through the woods, from the disorientation of a gravedigger under the sway of the vampire in the coffin below, from every appearance of the victims turned vampires to the harrowing conclusion. This is a book that will cause goosebumps start to finish. The tone, like I said, is so palpable. The dread, the tension is very much on display. This is as I said earlier, this is a book definitely to be read around Halloween. But with that said, it's not just like Carrie. This is not serious with a capital S. King understands that with life, there are different flavors of life, and that even in the darkest, most dread-filled moments, there's humor to be had. And just when you think that you can't take it anymore, King incorporates a little bit of humor just to lighten the mood, because he understands that you are sitting down to read something that he is giving to you, and it shouldn't be a chore. Yes, he wants to invoke, a feeling of fear. He wants you to look in the corners of your dark room. He wants you to be a little afraid that there's something, under your bed. But he also wants you to have a good time, because he had a good time writing it. At times, I know at times he also thought it was a chore. And as you'll see with Cujo, he doesn't remember writing that one at all. But there's definitely humor to be had. For instance, when we first meet Father Callahan, and he is at his desk and he's drinking and he's reminiscing on how he wants to write a novel about New England churches and Christianity in New England. And he procrastinates the entire time because all he does is write notes. And, King writes, in the beginning there was scotch, and Father Callahan said, let there be notes. It shows that King has a humor. It shows that Father Callahan has a humor. He understands that, he's an alcoholic, but he doesn't loathe himself because of it. And, King, he does a good job at just making us stop every now and then think about what it would be like in real life if we encountered the characters in his books. And that happens towards the end of the novel when things are just going out of control. The town is falling apart, vampires are running wild, and our ragtag collection of characters have their backs up against it. It's not looking good for them. So just imagine interacting with these characters, because that's what happens to the florist on page 314 when the gang has discovered that Straker has bought up all of the roses. And King writes, the proprietor stared after them, 3 men, one of them a priest, and a little boy who sat in a car with MD plates and shouted at each other of total lunacies. So I can just picture watching this car filled with 3 men and a boy. One of the men is a priest. One of the other men is a doctor, and everyone's just shouting at each other. How ridiculous that looks. And I like how Stephen King understands that there is a ridiculousness, and he celebrates it. And I think the fact that he does take the time to celebrate it shows that we can have fun with the story. So let's talk about some of the characters, starting with Ben. Ben is our protagonist, and in our very first introduction with him, from pages 13 to 17, it tells us everything we need to know about him. He's returning home to Salem's lot. He's afraid of the Marston house. He is a writer, and then in a little bit of a problematic fashion, King discusses that he lost his wife, and then immediately on page 19, while it's fresh in our minds that he has lost his wife, he starts hitting on a girl in the park whom he describes as being the prettiest girl in the park. And I understand that King thought it was necessary for him to have a tragic backstory, and I get that. But at the same time, I think that there can be a little bit of a delay in the information that we get, by putting it up front and immediately having him fall in love with someone and setting up the love interest. It just makes me as a reader question his faithfulness to his deceased wife. Now, I'm not saying that he needs to live a celibate life for the rest of his life, but just for me, my own reader's reaction was that I kind of liked him less for going after the prettiest girl, who we all know is Susan, right after the fact that it was established that his wife was dead. So Ben is an intellect, but he can hang with the blue-collar folk. He's proactive. He's heroic in a quiet sort of way, as evidenced by looking for the Glick boy. He takes it into his own hands, and joins up with Matt, his mentor figure, and Jimmy and Susan and Mark to combat the vampire threat. Once in Mexico, he decides to return to end the vampire threat once and for all. So, I mean, he has a lot of heroic qualities, which is great. You can tell he's haunted throughout the entire story, as if he never made it out of the Marston house as a boy, because that's one of the backstories that we get, is when he was in the Marston house as a boy, he was dared to go up there, and he discovered the ghost of the previous owner hanging from the rafters, and he swears that it was a ghost and not a hallucination. So, like I said earlier, this is a supernatural novel. Unlike Carrie, which was sci-fi, this is supernatural, and King deals so well with the supernatural. So another thing about Ben is that through Ben, that I find interesting here, is that King begins an argument against style of thought found within college courses, the kind of which both he and Ben had attended. It manifests itself with a disdain for stylistic literary expectations, where writers are expected to imbue everything with meaning, and the belief that a lack of meaning equals a poor excuse in literature. In the novel It, Bill Denbrough will argue with his college professor and ask a very valid question, that why can't a story just be a story? With Matt, Burke, and Ben, the two of them bond over their love of learning and their weariness of the institution of learning. And it's definitely something that Stephen King feels, and it's creeping into his character here. So when it comes to Ben, his experience with the Marston house and his belief in its existence as a beacon for evil allows for him to assist Matt when Mike Ryerson is turned. Now, if Ben had not experienced that supernatural aspect of the Marston house when he was a child, I don't know if he would have been so readily gung-ho about joining up to slay vampires, but he had experienced something that he could not explain, and it allowed for him to be that much more open to what Matt says about the vampires. I'm not going to talk too much more about Ben. As a character, he is. And he's kind of thin. He has the backstory of having originally been from Salem's Lot. Through him, we get a great deal of the backstory of the Marston house, but other than that, he's kind of a cipher. He's a good guy. He's not really deep. He's a writer. He loves the girl. Unfortunately, at the end, he has to drive a stake through her heart. He partners up with the old man and the boy, and he ultimately saves the day. So in terms of complex characters, Ben is not a complex character. He is our protagonist. He is serviceable, but he doesn't make or break the story. I think that you could have swapped him out with another character and it would have been just as effective. There are there are other characters in a novel that really come to life that could have been the substitution for Ben that I think would have worked. I think that Matt is a very strong character. I think Father Callahan is a very strong character. That both serve very well as those supporting characters. But Ben is just he's kind of there. And he gets along well with others because he kind of just is like everybody else. I think that if they took the Jimmy Cody character, the doctor, and put him instead of Ben, the narrative would have been exactly the same. And up next we have the second character that we meet, if you want to call this character a character at all, which I think tells you how I feel, but and that's Susan. So on page 18 through 19, we are introduced to her, but I would argue that we're not introduced to a character. We are introduced to a plot device that immediately is designed to give us information about Ben's novel and Ben. So right away, she is defined by her appreciation of the protagonist. To me, this is not off to a good start. In fact, I find it very problematic. She's being introduced to us as being defined by her fandom for Ben. So right away, she doesn't function as her own character. She functions as an extension of the male character, the protagonist. And Stephen King is going to, later in his career, have a string of female-centered characters and books. And he does a really good job at just the female character, but not here, not in Salem's Lot. And he did so in his previous novel. I think that Carrie is an incredibly strong, complex character, but not Susan. So on page 25, we have a conflict established because it's hinted that she's in a relationship with someone else. So again, she's now defined not necessarily by one person, Ben, but someone else now, Floyd. So all of a sudden we have this romantic triangle that I don't think serves the story. I think that it severely hurts Susan. And then by the time page 30 rolls around, I started to question whether or not my criticism was being addressed by Stephen King. Because this is a scene between Susan and her mother, and they begin to argue about her future and what she's going to do. And Susan just at that point, for someone that, she had just graduated college and she's ready to, tackle the world. In this scene, she seems so young. And I don't know if that really speaks to, who she is as a character, if there's a little bit of a contradiction, an intentional contradiction on Stephen King's part between, the woman she wants to be and the girl she currently is. If that's intentional, then bravo, Stephen King, bravo. I think that that's a great job. If it's unintentional, I think that it hurts the character, because she still has this vestigial, "aw, mom," sort of relationship where she just is so frustrated with her mother, and she I don't want to say she throws a temper tantrum, but I guess it's one step removed from that. And then while Ben goes off to be a proactive character, she then, when he comes back, she's cooking after him, and all the other males are talking about what a great, attribute that is, and what a lucky guy he is. And, is she perpetuating outdated stereotypes, or is she a character trying to break out of stereotypes pressed upon her by a town that's just a little bit behind the times? If it's the latter, then it gives the town even more shading than it currently has. But if it's the former, to me, it's weak character work. On page 183, we get a little bit of her thoughts, and she wants to say "I love you" to Ben. And at that time, I'm reading it, I asked why. I don't feel as though that moment is very earned. What have we seen from this relationship? He's a slightly famous outsider with roots in the town, and she just happens to be a fan of his. He's taken her out to eat. They've had dinner. He's come over for the family, but what give and take has occurred? So again, is this just unearned characterization, or is King revealing that she's emotionally younger than she thinks she is? And then Susan goes and does it. It just made me go, really, Susan, really? You decide it's for the best for you to go to the Marston house by yourself. Okay, what she does here, this is the literary equivalent of screaming at the movie screen for the character to not go down the stairs. And I acknowledge the hypocrisy of my statement. All right, full out of the way. I'm going to get this out of the way. I acknowledge this. I'm going to call her out for being idiotic for her going to the Marston house, but I'm also going to say that Mark Petrie is also very brave for doing the exact same thing. But I would argue that Mark, who is also journeying to the Marston house alone, is brave because he's a child, first of all, and unlike Susan, he does not have a group to rely on. For all Mark knows, he is the only one in town who is aware of the vampires. So that's really all I have for Susan. She'll team up with Mark. She will be turned into a vampire, and Ben will have to stake her in the heart, and that will be the story of Susan. Ben will go on. I don't know. Maybe he's going to move to another town. He'll think about her for a second, then meet the prettiest girl in the park of the town he happens to be in, and the cycle will repeat itself. But it's too bad. She seemed like a very nice character. Don't get me wrong, but in terms of adding to the plot, I don't feel as though she does anything. I think her actions are felt through her male counterparts, and her death spurns Ben into action. So she's the damsel in distress, what it comes down to. And Stephen King will later go on to prove that he can write, female characters, having legs of their own, having thoughts of their own, being strong, female characters. But I don't think that Susan fits that mold right now. But the question is whether or not that is intentional. If the shadings of that character, those inconsistencies and those weaknesses are intentional on the part of the author. So I know that when I covered Carrie, I went into detail about Sue Snell, and I kind of bashed her, and now I'm bashing Susan, so I just don't know if it's the name. But just like Sue Snell, constant reader, please write in to share your thoughts about whether or not you think that Susan is a strong character, a weak character, if I'm overanalyzing it, or if there's something that I don't see. So another character in the town that is brought to life through great description on Stephen King's part, is the Marston house itself. Basically, just picture Dracula's castle looming over the town, and that's it in a nutshell. It's always casting a shadow. Even after Ben and Susan have a lovely milkshake and make plans, Ben's thoughts turn to the Marston house. It's always there. It's always in eyesight, and even if it is out of sight, it's in someone's mind. Pages 33 to 36, it gives you the background, great history. It just really makes you wonder what happened to the Marstons. What drew this man, who was a bad man, but what drew him to that spot to build a house right there? Had he heard voices, pulling him there? Were these the same voices that made him kill his wife? Or was the house itself evil because he himself was evil? Where did the evil begin? Did evil call out evil? Did he, as an evil man, build the evil? I think that because, I've read the other works of Stephen King, I think that there's something about that spot that drew him, and the evilness soaked into the beams and the floors and the walls and the plaster and poisoned the house itself. But the house necessarily is not poison. It's that particular location, and something about it drew Hubert Marston there, and just, I know that he was a bad man. I think it made him a little bit worse, a little bit evil, a little bit more off balance, and slightly drove him insane. So now that it's haunted in the minds of the town people, the house, it's the house that children use to scare each other. So it's perfect that Stephen King, creates this small town complete with that haunted house. And as I'm going to get into later in the podcast, I'm going to actually differentiate here that it is not necessarily a haunted house, but a trope that Stephen King will use again and again, and that's that of the evil house. So there's a great moment in the text on page 38 in which Ben and Susan are talking about the Marston house, and specifically his experience at the Marston house when he was a boy. And through Ben, I believe that King is working out an ongoing philosophy he's going to have when it comes to the idea of haunted houses. And it's as follows. Probably I was so keyed up that I hallucinated the whole thing. On the other hand, there may be some truth in the idea that houses absorb the emotions that are spent in them, that they hold a kind of dry charge. Perhaps the right personality, that of an imaginative boy, for instance, could act as a catalyst on that dry charge and cause it to produce an active manifestation of something. I'm not talking about ghosts precisely. I'm talking about a kind of psychic television in 3 dimensions, perhaps even something alive, a monster, if you'd like. Ultimately, good will win the day. Father Callahan, in one of his final acts, will bless the house. He will banish the evil from it, and that will make sure that Barlow cannot enter it again. So it will actually throw Barlow into hiding. But up until then, the house is a great character in the novel. I'm not gonna call it a setting because it's not. It is a dark entity within that town, a dark idol, as it's described by one character. Ben believes that it is a beacon, and that evil nature has drawn another evil man in the form of Barlow and Straker to town. So again, if King had not included the Marston house, I don't think that Salem's Lot would be quite as effective as it is. It's basically, as I said, you take Dracula's castle and you put it in a small town, except he...
Looking for an escape? Try Ghosts in the Burbs, a podcast that began as a collection of stories about the people of Wellesley, Massachusetts, and the ghosts and monsters who haunt them, and expanded to include cozy scares in other suburban settings. Ghosts in the Burbs is written by me, Liz Sauer. These stories include no gore, no extreme horror, and no ads, ever. Just cozy, creepy escape. Find Ghosts in the Burbs wherever you listen to podcasts.
He spent the time to make Dracula's castle a living, breathing character. So let's talk about Matt Burke. He's our mentor of Ben. So if you know anything about Joseph Campbell's hero journey, as soon as he's introduced and he meets up with Ben and they strike a friendship, and he sort of takes the reins as the leader, you know that he's the mentor, and therefore you know that he has to die in order for the hero to complete his quest, and that's exactly what happens. He has a rather the world doesn't end with a bang but a whimper moment when he dies, when his heart finally just gives out in the hospital. But as soon as Matt was introduced, I couldn't help but think that King had created this character as an alternate reality version of himself, who lives a long, happy life as an English teacher, having never published Carrie. He's savvy, he's open to possibilities most would scoff at. On page 158, Matt sees Mike Ryerson at the bar. This is where we see the effect of the vampire. Before, King had teased it out secondhand and hid it behind the doctor's notes of the Glick boy, but now we have one of our main characters interacting with a victim of vampirism and soon to be a vampire himself. With the introduction of Barlow at the dump, the threat comes out of the shadows into the forefront of the narrative. Now, Matt knows that something is wrong with Mike's story, visitors at the window, sleeping until dawn, and his offer for Mike to sleep at his place reveals that Matt is all at once kind for taking in a sickly former student, brave to do so as he has the suspicion that something may be preying upon him, and rational in the sense that in order to prove his suspicion, he must monitor the situation, specifically Mike himself. This leads to one of the most impressively terrifying moments in the story that just pops off of the page. It sticks with the reader, and if it causes your nightmares, then Stephen King did his job, and I wouldn't be surprised if that particular chapter caused number of nightmares to all of the readers that read it. And that scene is when Matt realizes that a vampire has come for Mike, and so paralyzed with fear he cannot do anything about it. Now, his ability to act does not illustrate a cowardly streak within him. It only depicts how most of us would act under these circumstances. Surely, when confronted with the monsters of our youth, wouldn't we revert to the child version of ourselves? If Matt had leapt out of bed and stormed his guest room with the Bible in one hand and the crucifix in the other as he had played out in his mind, it would have rang false to me. See, those are the actions of a character in an action movie, and this is a perfect example of what makes King stand apart from other writers. His characters aren't wish fulfillment vehicles. They're everyday representations of the characters you encounter in your everyday life. And while it's certainly cool to think of your old high school teacher instinctively equipped with the fortitude to slay a vampire upon first contact, it isn't necessarily realistic. And as we explored last week in Carrie, every time King presents the supernatural, he's able to ground it in a recognizable reality, which, with the contrast established, makes the supernatural elements pop that much more. If Matt had dashed into the room, the scene would not have been as effective due to the fact that at that point, he would be one of the fantastical elements. Without the juxtaposition of the recognizable against the recognizable, the scene cannot function. So once he suffers his heart attack, Matt is taken out of physical action and proceeds to take up the role of a general in his war against Barlow. And to mix metaphors, both characters begin to play chess with one another, Barlow reveling in the joy that comes from disorienting his opponents as he takes the pieces from the board one by one. And as I said, Matt has to die in order for Ben, our hero, to complete his quest of slaying the vampire, the dragon, the mentor figure. Has to die, and it's only upon his death that the end of the story comes when Ben, the knight with his squire in tow, is able to go to the dragon's cave and slay the dragon. And I really could not wait when I was reading the book to actually get to this part where I can really go into depth and talk about this particular character, this next one here, Father Callahan, who might be the strongest written character in the novel, and any Stephen King fan worth their salt knows that this character means a lot to Stephen King. And spoiler alert, everybody, if you have not read much of Stephen King, I'm gonna let the cat out of the bag right now. We don't see the end of Father Callahan. So in this text, he had been referenced a couple times, but we first meet him on page 126 and 127 with a description on 127. He's introduced as a kind man with a drinking problem, And that kindness is shown due to the fact that at the funeral, he of the Glick boy, he doesn't want to draw out the parents' anguish, but he does want to do a good job at the service and say something kind, but he doesn't want to belabor the point because he understands that the pain is.
You are more than just a heart patient. At Trinity Health of New England, we get to know you, which can help us diagnose a problem and start treatment faster. Our cardiovascular team offers the latest imaging and device technology, testing, and surgical procedures you'd expect from a national health system, with the personal touch you want from local experts. We know the importance of seeing the person behind the patient because we see all of you. Learn more at trinityhealthofne.org/heart.
Is going to be too much to bear. Now, we all know, okay, it's well known that Stephen King has suffered and thankfully conquered substance abuse problems. With Father Callahan, the question is, do we see a young writer begin to publicly exercise his demons on the printed page? King will soon, very soon, explore the battle with alcoholism, more famously with the character of Jack Torrance in The Shining. But at this moment in time, are we witnessing the beginning of Stephen King's dependency on alcohol? After all, Father Callahan, King's surrogate in the novel, recalls that the alcoholism and the writing began at the same time. Now, is King confessing to the reader? By the end of the novel, Father Callahan heartbreakingly loses his battle of faith. Does that mean that he's representing King's own internal battle, one of dependency, where his own strength is overpowered by the lure of the bottle? More thematically, what is King saying with this character? On pages 147 to 149, he describes how the confessions of the townspeople are contributing to Callahan's withdrawal from grace and faith. Is King stating that the small malicious evils of small-town America are overcoming the good as represented by Callahan? Or is he stating that because good has weakened, the townspeople are giving in to their worst urges? King describes Father Callahan as a priest without much of a purpose. As I just stated, the confessions from all the townspeople just aren't doing it for him. You know, he's not seeing necessarily the good in people, and you know, he reflects upon the changes that the Catholic Church has gone through in the last decade or so at the time, and you know, he thinks about the nature of evil, and in a way he wants evil with a capital E to manifest itself so that he can combat it. So while looking at the light within the window of the Marston house, he calls for a battle against evil, and that call is answered. But sadly, he will be too weak to win that battle at this time. But as I said, fear not, constant reader, this will not be the last we see of Father Callahan. Stay tuned after the podcast for more discussion on this memorable character. But in the meantime, his relationship with the church paints the church in an incredibly positive light. The Catholic Church has taken a number of beatings since the publication, and regardless of anyone's religious belief, I believe it's powerful to see any organized religion as an official pipeline to the power of God. And as strange as it might be to describe a priest as badass, I think it totally fits here. Just look at the scene where the gang finally makes it to the Marston house and debate how to break the door down. Callahan confidently strolls up like a boss and proceeds to command the door to open with the power of God. And under the force of his voice and the divine power supporting it, the lock breaks off in a flash of blue light. And I just wanted Father Callahan to just drop the mic and walk off stage. That would have been perfect. But unfortunately, this confidence is not strong enough to beat the evil when it presents itself in the final confrontation with him. When finally confronted with Barlow in the Petrie's kitchen, after gaining the initial advantage, he relents. And in that moment, Barlow is able to take control of the situation, turning the scene into a theological game of chicken, both characters locked behind the wheels of their respective faiths, with the first to blink the loser. Except with Callahan's case, he's putting his soul on the line, and it's a horrible scene to read. It's so effective as the blowing glue light of his cross slowly starts to fade, and then just knowing that he's basically just powerless against this master vampire who decides not to kill him, or not to turn him into a vampire, but to corrupt him and taint him and banish him from the church and the God that he believed in and the God that he believes he failed. It's a truly heartbreaking scene. And then Stephen King doesn't just end it there. We actually have a few more scenes where Callahan, it walks the streets. He tries to enter the church. He is cast back. He is cast out. He is not accepted by the vampires. He is he knows that he's no longer human. He's this strange in between creature, neither of the light nor of the dark, that is now cursed to wander the lands. And for someone that had been presented as such a strong and kind character, it's truly a tragic moment in this novel. Next, I want to look at Mark here, because I think that this is an incredible character. He's introduced on page 53 as a savvy kid, completely unimpressed with the bully. In fact, he just looks put out that he has to put up with it. He's described as sighing as he takes off his glasses. He's not afraid of him whatsoever. He's just, his time is being wasted. And by presenting him right away as someone that's able to take out this kid that's bigger than him really goes a long way in showing, not telling, the kind of character that Mark is. He's not your typical child character in a novel. In fact, he reads like some sort of 30-year-old in the mind or in the body of a child that I absolutely loved. And I didn't catch it, just how different he was, that he wasn't your typical kid. Although there are a lot of aspects of his childhood that I was able to relate to, specifically his adoration of monster culture, but I read him as this little adult in the body of a kid, which I just thought was a great choice. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He's quiet, but he's not tortured like so many introverts depicted in popular fiction. Like I said, he's so logical and rational and so well adjusted. It's more the qualities and characteristics you would see out of an adult rather than an adolescent. There's a great description of his character on page 138. You can tell from this scene that Mark, even more than our protagonist, is probably best equipped to deal with the vampire problem, a theme that will run throughout Stephen King's works, and that is that of the child blessed with a sense of wonder and magic that gets lost in adulthood. And that child is more naturally suited to combat the things that go bump in the night, those things that defy the rational world occupied by adults. This will be seen outside of the works of Stephen King as well. The Lost Boys comes to mind, another vampire in the small town setting in which a group of boys, including the monster-loving Frog Brothers, are the only hopes that stand against the predatory vampire pack. And Mark, as characters go, on page 230, he is the star of what I would say is the most iconic scene from this story, popularized from the TV movie adaptation, in which Danny Glick finally makes it to his house, paying him a visit outside the window. Mark knows right away what he's dealing with, and he cannot be lured to his death so easily. In order to combat the temptation to look in Danny's eyes and thereby succumb to hypnosis, he repeats a phrase that will later be uttered by Bill Denbrough in It for similar effect, and that phrase is as follows. He thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghosts. He then grabs a crucifix, opens the window, and banishes the vampire with an accompanying supernatural flare of a glowing cross. In that moment, it reinforces again that in order for Ben and company to defeat the vampires, they will need this boy who I imagine, in an alternate world, could have been best friends with the Losers Club and two other boys by the name of Jack Sawyer and Jake Chambers. His bravery is on display when he ventures to the Marston house by himself to dispatch the vampire. When he encounters Susan, he makes short work of her adult excuses for holding a stake and cuts to the quick with impatience. You're here to kill the vampire. Oh no, she says, I just found it in the woods. I don't know what I'm doing with this. And he just cuts and he says, no, you're here to kill the vampire. Why else would you be holding a stake? So again, the reader understands that Mark is better equipped for vampire slaying than his adult counterparts, and he forces the truth from her and rationalizes what she herself could not, that it's better to do this with someone than by yourself. When Mark is captured by Barlow, soon after, King ratchets up the tension with the tied-up boy, the setting sun, and a hungry vampire waiting below. Mark, however, is clearly up to the challenge, and with cool detachment calls upon his knowledge of yogi masters and Harry Houdini to escape his holds. He then knocks out and kills Barlow like a champ, escapes, get home. Unfortunately, Susan does not make it. He does try to save her, but he knows that if he ventures into the basement, he too will die. And then for the rest of the novel, he's part of the group. He advises Ben on what to do, but the events that will happen later, specifically with the death of his parents, it will shake him, and he's not going to have too many standout moments like this. And I wish that he had been a stronger presence in the novel, because the scenes that he was in certainly were scenes that shined. And I believe that King, he's going to keep going back to the well of childhood characters, and we're going to see this kind of child again. But we're not going to see Mark again, which is too bad, because I really did enjoy spending some time with him. And that's all that I have for our heroes. We can talk a little bit about our villains here, starting with Straker. Genius on Stephen King's part to introduce us to Straker first. So he imagined Salem's Lot as Dracula in a small town setting, and you can't have Dracula unless you have your Renfield. So that is the function that Straker serves. He is our Renfield. But he comes across as so intelligent, so urbane, so devilish that he keeps making reference to his partner, Mr. Barlow, and you just can't help but think as you're reading that if this guy, all right, if Straker is this bad, then how bad is his partner? And once the vampires start to infect the town, you might think that, oh well, a human character like Barlow won't or Straker won't make much of a difference, and it won't be as frightening. But I really beg to differ, because once things start hitting the fan, Straker is still very, very active. In fact, there's the scene between he and Mark that is it's terrifying. It's very thrilling. He ties Mark up, and the sun is setting, and he is the threat in that scene. Not Barlow. So he's one of, I'm going to get into this in a little bit, but he is a great charismatic villain, and just sets up the reveal of Barlow masterly. And in terms of Barlow, if you're going to have your Dracula in a small town, well, you definitely need your Dracula, and he is a fantastic Dracula to have. Because right after we get the background of him through the Parkins investigation, we meet him for the first time on page 143 at the town dump. Much in the same way that King teased the reveal of Margaret White building up her character, letting its shadow grow in our minds, he does the same for Barlow, and he doesn't disappoint. But this is, if he's Dracula, he's a Dracula that doesn't want to hide from his enemies. In fact, he revels in the conflict. He really appreciates the challenge, and I think that it's because it's a break from the boredom that accumulates with his immortality. Only one character left to talk about in this book. And that character happens to share the same name as the title of the novel, and that's Salem's Lot. Now, in Carrie, King had started to dabble in making a well-lived-in town with Chamberlain, Maine. But unlike Chamberlain, Maine, Salem's Lot is a character in this novel. Chamberlain felt lived in, and King took the time to establish some background on some of the establishments, and he populated it with secondary and tertiary characters that had enough characterization to make them feel real. But he takes that concept and he injects it with steroids. And more than anything else, this novel could not work if he did not establish the town as a character. There's an incredible description of the town on page 26. He will stop the narrative many times throughout the text to just give us some sort of check-in with the town as a town. He will describe various elements of the town, but I think what really establishes the town as a character and really establishes King as a force to be reckoned with as a writer takes place between pages 42 and 78. In the previous two chapters, each chapter had been dedicated to a different character in the novel. The first one being Ben, the second one being Susan. This is chapter 3, and in this chapter, he very clearly states that Salem's Lot is a character, and he spends between pages 42 and 78 describing this character. It's an incredible chapter, and what he does is he shows how the town is a machine, and it made up of all these different gears that interlock with one another and just make the machine work. And it's important because without establishing the town as a living character, its death, which will come by the end of the novel, cannot be effective. So, I mean, in that scene, we meet the young farm boy who hates school, the milkman whose knee acts up, the owner of the boarding house who enjoys her morning of solitude, the paper boy who can't throw straight, the abusive teenage mother in over her head who would trade in her life for the one of her high school dreams, the cemetery groundskeeper who would like to finish college, the no-nonsense bus driver, the drunk housekeeper, the schoolyard bully and the new kid who fights back, the hunchback town dump custodian who loves shooting rats, the pervy and corrupt real estate agent, the phone line repairman having an affair with the seductive married beauty queen, the aging solitary high school English teacher who loves his job and thinks rock and roll is fine music, the self-made town selectman who judges a man on the firmness of grip, taste in beer, and appreciates a satisfactory burp, the two brothers who make the unwise decision to walk through the woods at night and pay for it, the overweight widow who lived for town gossip, and the dark figure offering a sacrifice to his master on the stroke of midnight. And with this scene, it concludes this particular chapter at 11:59 p.m., in which the dark figure makes a sacrifice to his master. And then from this point forward, this is where all the supernatural elements really start to take hold in the town, and everything starts to lose control. This is where we start to make the shift into dark territory. So once the town is established, King begins its ruination. When the boys go missing, we, the reader, know that one is dead from the final scene in the cemetery. We don't know exactly what happens to the other. Soon he will show up. But he spent so much time building up this town. He needed to build up this town. And once he does that, he can start to tear it apart. But the town is the body. Okay, and if the town is the body, then its streets are the arteries and the veins, and we are the nutrients coursing through those veins. So when the characters are poisoned by the vampirism, so is the town until the town itself is turned. Ultimately, Ben has to return to the lot a second time to put a stake through it. He's killed the master, which was the cause of the infection, and he killed a number of the vampires, but ultimately the town itself is now a living, breathing town vampire. And at the end of the novel, he doesn't just return to kill the vampires living within it. He has to kill the town itself. And we get another scene of the lot as a character later, much like the one that I had just described. But this time, King checks in with the townspeople as they are either vampires or on the verge of becoming vampires. So we get to check in throughout the course of the novel and see the ruination of the town. Just as I did with Carrie, I think that it's important to check in to see the writer's intention and the writer's reasoning for writing the book. So I'm just going to read about what King has to say about Salem's Lot. So the title that King originally chose for this book was Second Coming, but he later decided on Jerusalem's Lot. King stated the reason behind that being his wife, novelist Tabitha King, thought the original title sounded too much like a bad sex story. King's publishers then shortened it to the current title, thinking the author's choice sounded too religious. Salem's Lot has been adapted into a television miniseries twice, first in 1979, then 2004. It was also adapted by the BBC as a 7-part radio play in 1995. In 2 separate interviews, King said that of all of his books, Salem's Lot was his favorite. In his June 1983 Playboy interview, the interviewer mentioned that because it was his favorite, King was planning a sequel. But he has more recently said on his website that since the Dark Tower series already picked up the story in the novels Wolves of the Kala and Song of Susanna, he felt there was no longer a need for one. In 1987, he told Phil Constantin in the Highway Patrolman magazine, "In My Way is my favorite story, mostly because of what it says about small towns. They are kind of a dying organism right now. This seems sort of down home to me. I have a special cold spot in my heart for it." The book is dedicated to King's daughter Naomi, for Naomi Rachel King promises to keep. While teaching a high school fantasy and science fiction course at Hampden Academy, King was inspired by Dracula, one of the books covered in the class. One night over supper, I wondered aloud what would happen if Dracula came back to the 20th century, to America. He'd probably be run over by a yellow cab on Park Avenue and killed, my wife said. In the introduction to the 2004 audiobook recording that Stephen King read himself, he says it was he who said probably he'd land in New York and be killed by a taxicab like Margaret Mitchell in Atlanta, and it was his wife who suggested a rural setting for the book. That closed the discussion, but in the following days my mind kept returning to the idea. It occurred to me that my wife was probably right. If the legendary Count came to New York, that is. If he were to show up in a sleepy little country town, what then? I decided I wanted to find out, so I wrote Salem's Lot, which was originally titled Second Coming. King expands on this thought in his essay for Adeline magazine on becoming a brand name. I began to turn the idea over in my mind, and it began to coalesce into a possible novel. I thought it would make a good one if I could create a fictional town with enough prosaic reality about it to offset the comic book menace of a bunch of vampires. Politics during the time influenced King's writing of the story. The corruption of the government was a significant factor for the inspiration of the story. I wrote Salem's Lot during the period when the Irvin Committee was sitting. It was also the period when we first learned of the Ellsberg break-in, the White House tapes, the connection between Gordon Liddy and the CIA, the news of enemies lists, and other fearful intelligence. During the spring, summer, and fall of '73, it seemed that the federal government had been involved in so much subterfuge and so many government operations that, like the bodies of the faceless wetbacks Juan Corona was convicted of slaughtering in California, the horror would never end. Every novel is to some extent an inadvertent psychological portrait of the novelist, and I think that the unspeakable obscenity in Salem's Lot has to do with my own disillusionment and consequent fear for the future. In a way, it is more closely related to Invasion of the Body Snatchers than it is to Dracula. The fear behind Salem's Lot seems to be that the government has invaded everybody. And I want to take a moment to actually insert something that if this is the case, then it's clear that Sheriff Parkins in this novel at the end decides to leave town, and King, who has publicly stated that his issues with the government helped influence the novel, I think that he's taking those issues and he's placing them all within this particular character who in another story would be the hero of the novel, the small town hero cop, but instead he represents the government not servicing those that he's supposed to. So King first wrote of Jerusalem's Lot in his short story, Jerusalem's Lot, of the same title, penned in college, and published years later for the first time in the anthology collection Night Shift. In his nonfiction book, Dance Macabre, King recalls a dream he had when he was 8 years old. In the dream, he saw the body of a hanged man dangling from the arm of a scaffold on a hill. The corpse bore a sign, Robert Burns, but when the wind caused the corpse to turn in the air, I saw that it was my face, rotted and picked by birds, but obviously mine, and then the corpse opened its eyes and looked at me. I woke up screaming, sure that a dead face would be leaning over me in the dark. 16 years later, I was able to use that dream as one of the central images in my novel Salem's Lot. I just changed the name of the corpse to Hubie Marston. King's paperback publisher bought the book for $550,000. In a 1969 installment of The Garbage Truck, a column King wrote for the University of Maine, King foreshadowed the coming of Salem's Lot by writing, in the early 1800s, a whole sect of Shakers, a rather strange and religious persuasion at best, disappeared from their village, Jeremiah's Lot, in Vermont. The town remains uninhabited to this day. In addition to Dracula, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, the opening passage of which King employed as an epigraph for part 1 of his novel, and Grace Metalius's Peyton Place are often cited as an inspiration for Salem's Lot. And just as I had done with the first podcast, I would like to conclude it with the King-isms that I found in the novel. Now, King-isms are the tropes and tricks and patterns that I've spotted that I know are going to pop up again and again in King works. So we have 7 King-isms found within this particular novel. The first of which, number 1, okay? The first one we have is the child saving the man prototype. That will definitely take hold in the Dark Tower. Now, he has already written the Gunslinger at this time, so the Gunslinger itself is a prototype for what we see between Ben and Mark. In this novel, we will later say this again with Roland and Jake. Now, the relationship between the duo of the adult and the boy on the quest will be explored more deeply. And I don't know if during the Dark Tower saga, if King makes reference to Ben and Mark, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did. The relationship intertwines with another Kingism, that of the power of childhood magic. In the face of a threat that life does not prepare an adult for, childhood innocence saves adulthood. Ben is saved through his relationship with Mark, just as the adults of it are saved due to the vestigial remains of their childhood selves. Write what you know is an oft-repeated phrase, so it should come as no surprise that Stephen King writes about authors, which comes to our second Stephen Kingism. So we have the protagonist author, which will be later seen in The Shining, It, Desperation, The Dark Half, Misery, and Bag of Bones, just to name a few. Number 3 is our evil house, and this is something that we see over and over again, and I want to make this distinction between the haunted house and the evil house. Stephen King does not write stories of haunted houses. His characters should be that lucky. Instead, his houses are evil creatures, sentient, lurking, preying on those that are foolish enough to enter the front door. The Marston house is the first but not the last, and so enamored was he with the concept of the evil house, he made it the villain of his next book, The Shining. The Overlook Hotel is a villain as memorable as Cujo, Christine, Pennywise, or Randall Flagg. We will see the evil house again on Neibolt Street, in the Wastelands, and in room 1408. Or Stephen Kingism is the unfunny joke. I covered this in Carrie, and the unfunny joke is a joke presented by one of the characters that the other characters find honestly humorous, that the reader, myself, does not find humorous at all. Which isn't to say that Stephen King doesn't have humor, but there's just jokes that people laugh at in his books that I don't think are very funny. The first one comes on page 19. It's when Ben and Susan meet for the first time, and she's reading his book, and she recognizes that, you know, that Ben, the author, is right before her. And, you know, she says, "Oh my God, you're Benjamin Mears." And then he responds in such a way that people don't talk like this. You know, people don't use language like this. And if anyone ever says anything like this to you, you have my permission to punch them in the face. So he says to her, "Of such inconsequential beginnings, dynasties are begun," he said. And although it was a joking throwaway remark, it hung oddly in the air, blah, 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 blah. Then she laughed and offered him the book. No. If someone says this, you don't laugh at that. You don't laugh at that. That's not funny. That's obnoxious. And the fact that this is one of the reasons why I don't like Susan is because she falls for him for saying stuff like this. And it makes me like Ben less. Our next unfunny joke takes place on page 23, where the sickening romance of Ben and Susan continues. After he has impressed her with that obnoxious remark, they are sitting and having milkshakes with one another, and they are talking about Mr. Spencer, one of the old folks back in town. And, you know, Ben says to her, she says to him, "Do you remember what he always used to say?" And this is what King writes. Ben hunched forward, twisted one hand into an arthritic claw, and turned one corner of his mouth down in a paralytic twist. "Your bladder," he whispered. "Those rut beers will destroy your bladder, bucko." Her laughter peeled upward towards the slowly rotating fan over their heads. Again, to me, it's not funny. I get what he's doing. It's a representation of the little things that make people bond with one another. But to me, it's always the person's reaction to the bad joke that gets me more than the bad joke itself. That there's more that I forgot. If there are unfunny jokes that I didn't catch, the groan-worthy moments, please let me know. Reach out to me at stephenkingcast@yahoo.com, and I'll share. Which brings us to number 5 of our Stephen Kingisms. That is that of the charismatic villain. So let's face it, Stephen King's villains tend to steal the show. Straker and Barlow definitely fall into this category. Both of these villains are so loquacious they wouldn't be out of place in a James Bond movie. They're both prone to monologuing and enjoy playing with their opponents, especially Barlow. The charismatic villain will be seen again with the likes of Randall Flagg, the Man in Black, Martin Broadcloak, Pennywise the Dancing Clown, the Tic-Toc Man, Blaine the Mono, the Crimson King, Atropos, George Stark, Leland Gaunt, Tack, Andre Lanoge, and Mr. Munchin, among others, not including the charismatic human villains that populate his work like Margaret White and Big Jim Rennie, Danforth Buster Keaton, and Percy Wetmore. Our number 6 Stephen Kingism is a really interesting one, because with this novel we can see that King clearly has planted the seeds that will grow into the novel Needful Things. Straker is a prototype for Needful Things antagonists, the devilish or devil himself, Leland Gaunt. Both characters run an antique shop and are prone to making soul-exchanging deals with the locals. Straker, in this case, deals with Crockett upon their first meeting, in which the Marston house and business establishment is exchanged for Crockett to own land upon which the up-and-coming businesses will be built. Furthermore, just like Needful Things, the townspeople are seen gathered, this time in Bab's beauty shop, talking about A, oncoming thunderstorms, and B, the interesting new antique store. This exact scene will be seen again in Needful Things. Number 7 of Stephen Kingisms, on page 154, Matt details how the older generations are making the connection between the disappearances of the children in the 30s with the disappearance of the Click Boy. This particular Kingism is the cycle of evil, and this will be explored at great depth and will be the running conflict of it, in which the Losers Club has to come back because they understand that the entity known as Pennywise the Dancing Clown resurfaces every 28 years, I believe, but evil is not something just so easily staked through the heart. It's an intangible entity that infects time and time and time again. And I said that there were 7, but there's actually 8 Kingisms. And this is the most important one. And I think that this sums up who Stephen King is a writer. And that is the strength of community. In Carrie, Stephen King explored the dark qualities of group mentality, but in Salem's Lot, we first see the popular Stephen Kingism of a collection of individuals banding together as a group to combat the supernatural threat. Only when we rely on each other can we overcome the conflict. We will see this again with It, The Stand, Desperation, The Dark Tower Saga, The Talisman, Christine, Eyes of the Dragon, Cell, and Under the Dome. Here in Salem's Lot, it begins with Matt and Ben, then Susan is brought in. Soon after, it's Jimmy Cody, then it's Mark, and Father Callahan. It's a small collection of people who will stand against the growing threat, even when those around them refuse to give in and help them, and will turn a blind eye or work with the threat. So this is why Stephen King is Stephen King, because he is an optimistic writer. He believes in community. He believes in the goodness of people, and that goodness is enough to stand up against the darkness and the things that go bump in the night. With that, the only thing that we have left is the quote of the book. If I could distill the essence of this book into one quote, what would it be? There's a number of contenders. On page 205, there's a small little portion of the text talking about the evilness of small towns. It's a quiet evil. It's not a supernatural evil. It's just there are town secrets, and some will later be known, and some will never be known. The town keeps them with the ultimate poker face. The town cares for devil's work no more than it cares for God's or man's. It knew darkness, and darkness was enough. I really want to point out on page 287, there is an incredible scene on the nature of evil between Matt Burke and Father Callahan. I strongly recommend it. I'm not going to read it, but I do point it out for everyone to go back and reread, because I think that it gives a lot of insight on Father Callahan and everything that we see in the text itself. There is a scene going back to what Stephen King had said earlier about the corruption of the government and what that means for small towns. That's reflected on page 379 when our sheriff turns tail and runs, and he says, "Alive. That's why he came here. It's dead like him. Has been for 20 years or more. Whole country's going the same way. Me and Nolly went to a drive-in show up in Falmouth a couple weeks ago, and just before they closed her down for the season, I seen more blood and killing in that first Western than I seen in years in Korea. Kids was eating popcorn and cheering them on." He gestured vaguely at the town, now lying unnaturally gilded in the broken rays of the westering sun, like a dream village. "They probably like being vampires, but not me. Nolly'd be in after me tonight. I'm going." But just his rumination on the death of small towns, I believe, is an important message that King is trying to convey to all of his readers. But the scene that I think is the most, well, maybe not the most important, but one that definitely spoke to me, maybe because it speaks to what he will later perfect in It, which will be the central thesis of that particular novel. It's the difference between children and adults, and he reinforces the power and magic of childhood and how that can stand up to the face of the supernatural threat. So on page, starts on 232, and it's Mark's thoughts. "So before drifting away entirely, he found himself reflecting, not for the first time, on the peculiarity of adults. They took laxatives, liquor, or sleeping pills to drive away their terrors so that sleep would come, and their terrors were so tame and domestic: the job, the money, what the teacher will think if I can't get Jenny nicer clothes, does my wife still love me, who are my friends? They were pallid compared to the fears every child lies cheek and jowl with in his dark bed, with no one to confess to in hope of perfect understanding but another child. There is no group therapy or psychiatry or community social services for the child who must cope with the thing under the bed or in the cellar every night, the thing which leers and capers and threatens just beyond the point where vision will reach. The same lonely battle must be fought night after night, and the only cure is the eventual ossification of the imaginary faculties, and this is called adulthood." In some shorter, simple mental shorthand, these thoughts passed through his brain. The night before, Matt Burke had faced such a dark thing and had been stricken by a heart seizure brought on by fright. Tonight, Mark Petrie had faced one, and 10 minutes later lay in the lap of sleep, the plastic cross still grasped loosely in his right hand like a child's rattle. Such is the difference between men and boys. And again, Mark distinguished himself throughout the novel as being the only one with the wherewithal to actually combat the supernatural threat. And that's all I have for this week. So stay tuned next week as I review the 1970s TV miniseries of Salem's Lot. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments. As I said before, I can't do this alone. I really want to engage in a discussion with everyone, and I would love to have an entire episode where I'm just interacting by answering emails and sharing what you have to say. So if you want to reach out, please feel free to do so at stephenkingcast@yahoo.com, and I will see you next week. But if you happen to be a fan of The Dark Tower, please stay tuned after the song that plays us out, where I can go into a little bit more detail about some of the events in Salem's Lot and how they pertain to the Dark Tower. Again, if you are not a Dark Tower fan, for all intents and purposes, this is the end of the podcast. So here to play us out, appropriately I believe, is John Mellencamp's Small Town. Thanks for sticking around, everyone. I hope to see you next week.
Town, and I live in a small town. Papa died
Okay, everybody, Dark Tower fans, welcome back. I hope that you enjoyed today's podcast, and I hope that you are looking forward to a little bit more discussion around the Dark Tower. So, if you've read the Dark Tower, you know that this is not the last that we see of Father Callahan. He shows up again. In fact, if you read the first of the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger, you'll know that he is in the way station, that he makes it to the way station just as Roland meets up with Jake. And in the re-release, remastered edition of the Gunslinger, the inside jacket, drawn by Michael Whelan, I believe, shows someone looking through the boards as Jake and Roland walk away, and I believe that the person watching them is Callahan. So, as I had discussed earlier in the podcast, I raised the question of whether or not Father Callahan is a stand-in for Stephen King as he begins to wrestle with his dependency issues on alcohol. So, if that's the case, and Stephen King understands that, then I believe that it's important that Callahan comes back, because by the time we see Father Callahan again, he is clean. He's cleaned himself up, and he will redeem himself throughout the course of the last three Dark Tower novels. So is this Stephen King, at that point, having beaten his own inner demons, allowing his own avatar to prove to the world that he's the man he always could have been? And you can tell that when he was writing Callahan, King felt strongly about this character. Even after he's tainted by Barlow, King offers a few chapters to his newfound cursed existence, when many of the other characters once turned are never seen again. Furthermore, he's eulogized by his housekeeper, who states that his inherent goodness, which to me serves as the question mark to movies from the 50s that would conclude with the words "the end" and ellipses and then the question mark. It's as if at that moment King the writer is King the character from the Dark Tower books, possessed by the force of the tower to keep Callahan's story open, because he will be integral to both Roland and the tower's survival. So Father Callahan is definitely one of the more important characters in Stephen King's works, due to the fact that he shows up again and saves the multiverse, but at the same time he's also an embodiment of King himself, written at two stages of his life, once at the beginning of dependency issues, and once after he has conquered them and redeems himself through the redemption of Father Callahan, and vice versa. So the question with the Marston house is this a door? Is this a doorway? Is this a thinny? Does it lead to the Todash spaces? There's definitely something about this spot that I alluded to in the podcast. I think that there's something about this land. There's something about the land, but what is it? And I think that it's one of those soft spaces between worlds. And we definitely see those again. And it just makes me wonder if Salem's Lot is under the path of the beam. If any one of the characters looked up into the sky, would they have seen the clouds moving against the wind currents as they headed along the path of the beam? I tend to think that the fictional towns in King's universe all fall under the town of the beam, and if they are, if it is under the beam, then my question is, Ben, was he unknowingly called there by the tower? I believe he was, and I believe that it was Ka that he meets Mark, because when the two of them meet, King describes this sensation that hits them both as more than chance coming together, like it was meant to be, and that's on page 300 if you want to check it out. So that fits in perfectly with destiny, or as King calls it, Ka. And on page 385, at the end, when Ben is trying to get to Barlow, there's a force that possesses him, and it's being described as older than Christianity, and it just fits in perfectly with the description of Gon and the turtle from the Dark Tower saga. So those are just a couple examples of connections to the Dark Tower. As you know, Father Callahan is in his redemption. He will encounter the granddaddies of the vampires, the pure not the weak ones like Barlow, which is so interesting. And he will confront the source of the evil that plagued him and his town, and he will utterly take them apart in one of the most triumphant scenes I have ever experienced reading, and I really look forward to getting there and rereading it again. So that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you next week. Again, if you have any questions or comments or any Dark Tower connections that you picked up that I might have missed, feel free to send me an email at stephenkingcast@yahoo.com. Until next week, I'll see you all here next week. Same King time, same King channel. Take care.